An 80-year-old woman goes missing, and police investigation leads them to a man recently released from prison for kidnapping. He denies any involvement and claims he dropped her home safely, but the evidence paints a different picture. As the detectives dig deeper, they uncover a series of chilling confessions that reveal a sinister truth. Welcome to Dark Truths.
Imagine this. You're looking at a grainy security video. Black and white footage, flickering. You lean in, trying to make out the details. And there she is. It's your mom, pulling out of the Food Lion parking lot. Just an ordinary day, right? But wait, there's someone else in the car with her. A man. And as you look closer, you realize you've seen his face before. On a wanted poster.
That's a chilling way to start. You're right. It sounds like we're about to dive into a story where the mundane takes a very dark turn.
Exactly. This is the case of Edna Suttles, an 80-year-old woman who vanished from Travelers Rest, South Carolina, back in August 2021. What seemed like an open and shut missing person case quickly became something far more sinister.
Okay, so let's start with the basics. What do we know about Edna's disappearance?
Well, Edna was supposed to visit a friend, but she never arrived. Her son started to worry when a worker who was scheduled to meet Edna at her house called and said she hadn't shown up.
So the police were called in, obviously. What did they find at Edna's home?
It was strange, really. Her house was completely undisturbed. No signs of forced entry, nothing out of place. Except for one glaring detail.
What was that?
A substantial amount of jewelry was missing. Nearly $50,000 worth, according to her family. And her car, a Jeep, was gone too.
Missing valuables, a missing car. Yeah, that definitely complicates things. Did the police have any leads to go on?
They caught a break 6 days later. They found Edna's Jeep, abandoned in a hotel parking lot right there in Travelers Rest.
Okay, so at least that's something. I imagine the police then used security footage from the hotel and other places to try and retrace her movements.
You got it. They painstakingly pieced together Edna's journey that day, starting from her home at 9:30 that morning. Security cameras showed her driving to a local Food Lion grocery store. 9 minutes later, she arrived at the Food Lion, picked up a man, and then they drove off together.
Interesting. So there's a man involved. Was he a friend? Someone she knew?
At that point, all they had was this grainy image from the security camera. But here's where things start to get really eerie. 4 hours later, Edna's car is seen leaving her house again, heading back to that same Food Lion. But this time, the man is driving.
He's driving her car. That's definitely not a good sign.
And it gets worse. The man parks Edna's Jeep in the Food Lion parking lot and drags something out of it into his own vehicle. A frame-by-frame analysis of the footage revealed. It wasn't an object he was dragging. It was Edna. You could even make out her distinctive blonde hair.
He's moving her from her car to his, then drives off in hers, leaving his behind. That's just cold.
Exactly. He then drove Edna's car to that hotel parking lot where it was found, abandoned it there. But before he left, he was seen on camera meticulously wiping down the door handles, the seats, trying to erase any trace of himself.
So he was being careful, trying to cover his tracks, but at least the police had him on camera. Were they able to identify him?
Well, remember those bags the man had with him when Edna picked him up? They were from the Food Lion.
Right, so he must have made a purchase there.
Exactly. The police zeroed in on that detail and scoured the store's security footage. And finally, they got a hit. They identified the man as Daniel Prince. And that's when everything changed.
Hold on. Daniel Prince, wasn't he involved in a previous kidnapping case?
You're right. 24 years earlier, Daniel Prince was convicted of kidnapping a woman in Michigan. He tied her up, shackled her, the whole 9 yards. It was a horrific ordeal.
How was he free to do this again? I thought he was convicted.
He was sentenced to 30 years. But there's a catch. He was paroled in 2009.
So we have a convicted kidnapper, now linked to another disappearance. The police had to act quickly. What did they do?
They wasted no time. They obtained a warrant to arrest Prince for grand larceny.
And for those listening who might not be familiar with the legal jargon, grand larceny basically means stealing something very valuable.
Right. In this case, Edna's Jeep. So they got the warrant and then searched his property.
Okay. And did they manage to apprehend him?
They did. But here's the unsettling part. When they arrested him, surrounded by heavily armed officers, he remained utterly calm, collected, almost as if he expected it.
That's strange. You'd think he'd be panicked or at least somewhat surprised. It almost sounds like he had a plan. What happened next? Did they bring him in for questioning?
Absolutely. The detective started out casually and trying to make him feel comfortable, asking about his work, his life after parole, eventually steering the conversation towards his past kidnapping conviction. They didn't want to tip their hand that they had him on camera just yet.
A classic interrogation tactic, trying to lull him into a false sense of security.
Exactly. And then, bam, they hit him with the footage from the Food Lion parking lot. The evidence was right there in front of him, impossible to deny.
So how did he react?
He actually seemed genuinely surprised. But even with the evidence staring him in the face, he denied everything. He claimed that Edna had asked him to meet her at the store because she was nervous about meeting a private investigator she'd hired, and that he just dropped Edna off at home, safe and sound.
So he was trying to deflect, create an alibi. But the police had tracked Edna's car all day, right? His story wouldn't hold up under scrutiny.
Exactly. There were just too many gaps in his timeline that he couldn't explain. And remember the mud on his tires? That suggested he'd driven off-road, maybe to dispose of evidence, or something worse.
Did they confront him about that? About the inconsistencies in his story?
Absolutely. They laid it all out for him. The inconsistencies, the missing time, the mud, the fact that they had seen everything on those security cameras. They even appealed to his conscience, reminding him that Edna's family was desperate for answers, desperate to know what happened to her.
Wow. The pressure must have been intense. Did he finally crack?
He did. But what he revealed, it was far more horrifying than anyone could have imagined. His confession went far beyond Edna. There were others.
Other victims. You're kidding.
I wish I was. His chilling confession revealed a pattern of violence that would shock even the most seasoned investigators. But to hear those details, you'll have to wait for the next part of our deep dive.
When we left off, Daniel Prince had just been arrested and was trying to mislead the police. But you mentioned his confession implicated him in other crimes, other victims. This is where the story gets even darker, right?
Oh, it definitely does. Prince admitted to not one, not two, but 3 more murders. Each more shocking than the last.
3 more? Wow. Okay, let's try to take this one step at a time. Who are these other victims?
His first victim, he claimed, was a woman named Dolores Sears. And this is where things take a really twisted turn. Prince actually told investigators that he euthanized Dolores at the request of her own daughter, Nancy Rigo.
Wait, he's saying the daughter was involved? She asked him to kill her own mother.
That's exactly what he claimed. That Nancy came to him, wanted him to end her mother's life. But then, according to Prince, Nancy started having second thoughts. She wanted to go to the police.
Knowing what we now know about Prince, that was an incredibly dangerous move. How could she think she could just back out like that?
You're telling me. And Prince, in his confession, said that's why Nancy became his next victim. He couldn't risk her exposing his role in Dolores's death.
So he kills the mother at the daughter's request and then eliminates the daughter to cover his tracks. It's just horrific. Was there anyone else?
There was one more victim Prince confessed to killing, a man named Lee Goodman. And his story about this one, it's so calculated. He claimed that Lee had tried to rob him.
So now he's claiming self-defense.
Exactly. Trying to paint himself as the victim. But we're talking about a convicted kidnapper here, now a confessed double murderer. How much of his story can we really believe?
Right, his claims definitely need to be corroborated. Did he say what happened to Lee Goodman's body?
Just like with Nancy and Edna. He claimed to have disposed of the body in a remote area. No specifics.
So at this point, they have 3 confirmed victims, plus Edna, whose body was still missing. What did investigators do next?
Well, they had Prince's confession, but they knew it wasn't enough. They needed physical evidence to build a solid case, especially if they wanted to locate Edna and bring her home.
Of course. A confession alone might not stand up in court. Did they find anything on his property that could back up his claims?
They did find a stash of automatic weapons, which was a huge red flag because, as a convicted felon, Prince wasn't allowed to own firearms.
That's another crime right there. More leverage for the prosecution. Did they find anything else that tied him to the murders?
They did. And this turned out to be a key piece of the puzzle. Remember those shopping bags Prince had at the Food Lion? The ones that helped the police identify him.
Right, the bags that placed him at the scene with Edna.
Well, on his property, they found a yogurt cup. The same kind of yogurt he'd bought at Food Lion shortly before Edna disappeared. And guess what? It was laced with a powerful cocktail of drugs. Lorazepam, tramadol, and cyclobenzaprine.
That's a dangerous combination. Lorazepam's a sedative, tramadol's a painkiller, and cyclobenzaprine's a muscle relaxant. Together, they would have made Edna incredibly drowsy, disoriented, unable to fight back or call for help.
It all started to make sense. He must have drugged Edna with that yogurt. It explains why she seems so dazed and out of it in that parking lot footage.
He had a plan. He knew exactly what he was doing.
And let's not forget his attempt to shift the blame. Remember, he told the police Edna was afraid of that private investigator.
Right, trying to make it seem like someone else was a threat to her.
But when they interviewed the investigator, he said he'd never even met Edna. It was all a lie. Just another one of Prince's lies.
So the walls were closing in, his story was falling apart. Did he finally confess to everything?
It took time. But under that mounting pressure, he cracked.
And this time, he admitted to harming Edna.
He admitted to all 4 murders, and he went into chilling detail describing how each one happened. He stuck to his claims about euthanizing Dolores, silencing Nancy, and acting in self-defense against Lee Goodman.
That confession, even without being filmed, must have been incredibly valuable for the prosecution. Did he lead them to Edna's body like he promised?
He did. But he struck a deal first. He'd revealed the location of Edna's body in exchange for having his case moved to federal court.
That was a pretty clever tactic. Why federal court? What was he hoping to gain from that?
Well, federal prisons are known for having better conditions than state prisons. Plus, he knew a federal trial could potentially help him avoid the death penalty.
So he's bargaining for his own comfort while showing absolutely no remorse for the lives he took. Unbelievable. Did the authorities agree to his terms?
They did, but they were playing it smart. They agreed to turn off the cameras during his confession about Edna's body. You know, as if giving him some control over the situation. But what he didn't know was that they kept the audio recording running the entire time. They had him on tape.
Wow, they outsmarted him. And what did he reveal in this recorded confession?
He confessed to all 4 murders, going into detail about each one. He recounted how he euthanized Dolores, killed Nancy to keep her quiet, and claimed self-defense in the case of Lee Goodman.
This confession, even without the cameras rolling, must have been a goldmine for the prosecution. And did he finally lead them to Edna's body?
He did. 1 year after her disappearance, on May 16, 2022, Edna's remains were found in a shallow grave not far from Prince's home in Rutherford County.
A tragic ending, but at least her family was finally able to lay her to rest.
It was a bittersweet moment for sure. Justice was being served, but the pain of her loss was still incredibly raw.
So with the confession and Edna's body recovered, what happened to Daniel Prince?
He knew he was caught. To avoid a trial, he pled guilty to federal charges. And in the end, he got what he wanted. A life sentence, no possibility of parole. He'll spend the rest of his days in a federal prison.
A fitting end for someone who committed such horrific acts. But this story doesn't end there, does it? We still have so many unanswered questions. Did Nancy Rigo really ask Prince to kill her own mother? Was Lee Goodman truly trying to rob him? And maybe the most haunting question of all, could there be more victims out there?
We'll delve into those questions and explore the remaining mysteries in the final part of our deep dive. We've been following this twisted path of Daniel Prince's crimes, a man who clearly preyed on vulnerable women, leaving a trail of devastation behind him. But even with a life sentence, there are still so many questions, so many things that just don't add up.
It is really fascinating, isn't it? How, even when he's facing the consequences, Prince is still trying to control the narrative. Remember, he bargained for that federal trial, all in exchange for revealing where he buried Edna.
He wanted to dictate the terms, even in defeat. It really gives you a glimpse into his manipulative nature.
And that manipulation extended to his claims about those other victims. Think about Nancy Rigo and her mother, Dolores.
He actually said that Nancy asked him to euthanize her mother, which is a pretty shocking claim to say the least. But is there any truth to it?
Well, it's certainly possible. You know, difficult family dynamics, maybe a desperate situation. I mean, we can't rule anything out. But at the same time, we have to consider Prince's history of deception. Was this just another attempt to shift the blame? To make himself seem less guilty?
It's a disturbing thought for sure. And it makes you wonder about his other claims too, like the alleged robbery attempt by Lee Goodman.
Exactly. Was it really self-defense, like he said? Or was it another calculated act of violence? Without more evidence, it's impossible to say for sure.
This case really underscores the challenges that investigators face when dealing with someone like Daniel Prince. A master manipulator. Someone who's very good at weaving lies into a semblance of truth.
And it raises the question, could there be more victims out there? Other cases that haven't been connected to him yet?
That's a haunting thought, especially considering his pattern of targeting elderly women who lived alone. He clearly had a type.
The authorities are definitely re-examining missing person cases, looking for any possible links to Prince. It's a long and painstaking process, but it's absolutely crucial.
This case really is a stark reminder of the darkness that can lurk in the most seemingly ordinary places. It's a reminder to be vigilant, to look out for the vulnerable, and to never underestimate the depths of human cruelty.
It also shows us how important thorough investigation is, never taking things at face value. We have to keep asking those tough questions, challenging assumptions, and seeking justice for every victim, even when the truth is buried deep.
The case of Daniel Prince is a chilling testament to the dark side of human nature and the relentless work required to untangle the web of lies and hold these kinds of perpetrators accountable. Though Prince is now behind bars, the scars of his crimes will likely linger forever. The families of his victims will continue to bear the weight of their loss. And for those investigators, the search for answers may never truly end.